Hello everybody! This Friday's video is not actually technically sponsored. Just someone asked for a bit of a shout out. I looked up what they did and I thought that's pretty cool. Let's give them an appropriate shout out. So this is the International Radio Controlled Warship Combat Club. They build 144th scale replica ships of World War One and World War Two, arm them with CO2 powered BB cannons, and then take them out onto lakes and rivers and shoot at each other. And eventually they sink when the bilge pumps get overwhelmed, and then they get salvaged, repaired, and put back into service again. Link for more details in the description, and they left this cool little trailer video as well. The use of old ships to test the effects of new weapons, or just to see how accurately a fleet was actually able to shoot, was a fairly well-established practice by the start of the 20th century. However, in almost all cases, the ships in question had either been completely static or very occasionally under a simple tow. Depending on whether this was a gunnery exercise or a test of new weapons, these restrictions would be in place simply because, well, in the former case of a gunnery exercise, general accuracy in the 19th century, as well as fighting range, was so low that nothing meaningful would be gained from the target doing anything particularly complex apart from just missing a lot. And in the latter case, in the weapons test, the intent was of course to examine what happened when the new weapon hit, rather than chase a target around the sea trying to score a hit in the first place. But as the 1910s drew to a close, things had changed significantly. No longer were fleets confined to Nelsonian battle ranges. Thanks to a combination of rangefinders, fire control systems, and the pressures of World War I, the expected battle ranges of capital ships had grown to the high tens and low 20s of thousands of yards, at which point ships changing course might manifestly actually affect your accuracy due to the much longer flight time of the shells. Whereas back at 1500 yards or so, the flight time of shells was so short, you might as well treat a target as static for the purposes of working out if its course or speed actually affected your ability to hit. And so the various large navies of the world began to try and work out how exactly to more accurately represent a possible enemy target, but without having large numbers of men operating a target ship and thus being in considerable danger. Luckily, radio technology had advanced considerably over the first 2 decades of the 20th century, and with a large number of obsolete ships available, some would be rigged as gigantic radio-controlled targets. Notable in these early efforts were the British semi-dreadnought HMS Agamemnon and the US pre-dreadnought USS Iowa. Today, we're going to take a quick look at the first of these two ships and discuss the equipment installed, how it worked, and what the ship got up to once it was turned into a glorified punching bag for the rest of the fleet. After the older HMS Hibernia was first considered for the role, Agamemnon was chosen as she was somewhat more modern and thought to be somewhat more durable, and so she was taken into Chatham Dockyard on the 10th of December 1920 for conversion into a radio-controlled target vessel, with the equipment coming from 3 main sources. The majority of the actual radio transmission and receiving equipment came from the Signal School at Portsmouth, which had spent much of the war refining radio control techniques, and thus had the most advanced transmitters and receivers of their kind. The control selector, that turned the incoming signals into various options, as well as much of the steering gear control mechanism, was sourced commercially from a telephone company, more on that later, and the other equipment, particularly that for changing the ship's acceleration, by altering things down in the engine rooms, was manufactured by the Chatham dockyards themselves once all the other equipment had been installed. As well as installing new equipment, a lot was removed. The 12-inch guns and all their mountings were removed, although the turrets themselves remained in place. The 9.2-inch secondary battery and the 12-pounder tertiary battery was also removed, in their cases entirely, including the 9.2-inch turrets. Also disappearing, among other things, were the upper portions of the masts, most of the internal equipment and fittings for the crew, since only a small skeleton crew would now be needed aboard for relatively short periods, along with most of the small external fittings like boats and davits, which would just be blown apart by incoming shell fire and which could be profitably used elsewhere. Many of the internal passageways and hatches were also sealed up, partly for watertight purposes and partly so that the few remaining crew didn't get lost. The work had been planned to take about 4 months, but it ended up actually taking around 7, owing to dockyard worker strikes. Eventually, the costs came to about £52,000, and the ship was pronounced ready for service on July the 12th, 1921, setting out for Portsmouth about 2 weeks later. The crew took the opportunity on the short voyage to test the various newly installed bits of control equipment without using external control transmissions to ensure that the controls themselves actually responded while the ship was moving at sea, using the manual input settings that were possible aboard the ship in one of the several control rooms. It was planned to use the old armoured cruiser HMS Antrim as the control ship, and she had been fitted with the relevant transmitter equipment. But almost as soon as Agamemnon arrived in Portsmouth, orders came down from on high for Antrim to be turned into a cadet training ship, and so the control equipment, which proved to be relatively easily removed, was transferred to the brand new destroyer HMS Truant, which had been sitting around with a reduced crew, serving as a tender to HMS Victory, and since the latter was soon to go into dry dock, Truant was readily available. In early August, Agamemnon was taken out to sea to determine if the controls would respond to external commands from the control ship, but these trials were cut short by the Admiralty declaring that the first operational use of the ship was going to be on the 25th, when the ship would face attack by aircraft. The control system was immensely complex for the time, with around 100 separate commands being available. And in the run-up to these tests, a number of electronic control triode valves, dubbed P-valves by the crew, blew out. But there was enough redundancy in the system that this didn't cause too much concern, the failure rate being considered acceptable for the relatively new technology. At least that is right up until the 26th, the second day of the trials, when every single valve blew out simultaneously and it became rather obvious that the safety cutouts needed a little bit of adjustment in order to protect the rest of the system. However, as the trials involved machine gun runs by aircraft and small bombs, neither of which was considered an existential threat to the ship, it was possible to continue with the tests, with the small crew just retreating to the protected portion of the ship, thanks to the availability of the manual inputs on the selector system. Once the ship was back in port, a search was made for more of the P-valves, but it turned out that the ship had already destroyed almost half of all such valves then in existence, and so the remainder were gathered up and fitted once modifications had been made to the safety cutouts in order to get the ship operational again. But the signal school, which was only a few miles up the road, was asked to send over valves of its own design, since if these worked, then they could be used as substitutes, and the Royal Navy would then be able to produce their own spares instead of relying on a very limited commercial supply, which at this point had clearly fallen short both in terms of numbers supplied and performance. As Truant had been assigned to the signal school generally, and was thus sometimes needed elsewhere, the sloop Snapdragon was also fitted with control equipment in early September. But despite modifications to Agamemnon's systems, the P-valves would continue to fail, and further testing was halted so that enough of them would be around when the ship was due to be run under machine gun fire by aircraft on September the 9th, which would also represent an important milestone, as these, as it turned out successful, tests would also represent the first time the ship was completely automated while it was under attack, with all crew leaving the ship once she was out at sea. whereas previously a small crew had sheltered in the citadel to guard against being needed in emergency situations. By the end of September, the Signal School had produced enough of its own valve design to be able to replace the P-valves entirely, and the fittings on the ship were modified to receive them, as it was anticipated that the Atlantic Fleet, one of the two main Royal Navy formations after the dissolution of the Grand Fleet, would want to use the ship for target practice on the high seas. But there turned out to be delays to that fleet exercise, which meant that the ship could continue to be worked on until early November. And it was just as well that there was a delay, since during trials in October, the steering gear seized up entirely. Luckily, the throttle still worked and the ship was successfully slowed so that the issue could be resolved. The Signal School also contracted out their valve design for large-scale production, which ensured a regular supply of spares without turning the Signal School itself into just a valve factory, since their new design seemed to work fairly well, and although there was the occasional failure, it was nowhere near as bad as it had been with the previous set. With that, all that remained to check before sending the ship out to be shot at by other warships was to see if the radio gear would survive the shocks of nearby shell blasts. Since randomly setting off large amounts of explosives while in dock was somewhat discouraged, the sailors improvised by attacking the aerials and the receivers with various sledgehammers, and then borrowing some 200-pound shells from a nearby stock of 7.5-inch ammunition and hauling them up as high as they could on the ship's cranes, and then just dropping them, obviously inert, onto the deck above the control rooms. None of these efforts seemed to perturb the control gear at all, and the whole system was actually extremely redundant, with no less than 8 sets of aerials and receivers fitted, all working in parallel, so the loss of one system, even to a direct hit from a large caliber shell, would not overly compromise the ship's operation, although one sailor aboard Snapdragon observed that they may be forced to circle the ship in such an event in order to find a working receiver, as each receiving aerial only covered a limited arc around the ship. Agamemnon was then sent out to the fleet, which in the first exercise subjected her to a hail of fire from the capital ship's secondary guns and destroyer main batteries. The main takeaway from this being that more gunnery practice was needed, as the first 700 rounds fired resulted in only 42 hits, despite all being fired from less than 10,000 yards. With the largest shells being flung in being 6-inch, the old battleship stood up pretty well to what hits she did sustain, and the only round of the entire exercise that made it past her armour was a beautiful long-distance shot from either Renown or Repulse, which came in from a somewhat greater range at a high enough angle and managed to punch through the upper deck armour. Agamemnon would then go on to serve for half a decade as the fleet's target ship, with Snapdragon being replaced by the faster destroyer Shikari in 1923. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be much in the way of sources about the ship's subsequent performance in various gunnery exercises, except that she was still alive and kicking when relieved by the old dreadnought Centurion in 1926, which had been similarly fitted and took over the role. I suspect that much of the evidence of this period can probably be found in the 1920s Royal Navy fleet exercise records, and I plan to try and study those in future archive visits. But that brief summary of Agamemnon's service life does allow us to briefly outline some of the more interesting features of the control equipment itself. The central control unit was a 100-output telephone line selector, with the control signal requests being made in the form of 2-digit codes that were dialed in on a rotary telephone dial aboard the controlling ship. Remember I said a bunch of the equipment came from a telephone company. Codes 00 to 35 were assigned to the desired course changes in increments of 10 degrees, with the system being set using a gyro compass by the crew before they left, with an absolute heading from which the needed course changes would then be derived. So, for example, if you dialed a code of 16, this would cause the ship to turn to starboard until it was steering 160 degrees away from its original heading. It being noted that there was about a 3 to 5 degree swing over or under when the ship was settling in on its course under radio control, but that once it had settled in, it was actually capable of fulfilling the demands made of it to within a degree or so of accuracy. Codes 36 through 49 were left unassigned for potential future uses, and 50 through 99 were used for various increments of speed, as well as unspecified testing purposes. When the ship turned, a pair of slip rings connected to the ship's gyro compass would rotate, with the electrical contacts for the various course changes physically spaced around one of the rings in 10-degree intervals. When the ship reached the desired course, an insulated portion of the lower ring would break the circuit that powered the steering gear, which allowed the ship to settle on course, with another gyroscope system then taking over to correct any over or underswing, hence why the 3 to 5 degree swing gradually became a 1 degree swing as the ship settled in. The motor driven by this system was connected to one of the ship's wheels by a bicycle chain, and so the ship's actual original steering system was used to actually turn the rudder, and the radio controls were just giving input. For safety purposes, there was a cutout that prevented the rudder from being turned more than 15 degrees to port or starboard, which gave the ship a gentle turning circle without all that much risk of jamming the rudder. In terms of speed, a pair of steam valves and 3 oil fuel pumps each had a controller attached to them with 10 possible settings, hence the need for 50 total code combinations, because you had 5 valves or pumps with 10 settings apiece. And this had a rather interesting safety mechanism. A small clockwork timer was present, which was set to 15 minutes. This reset itself every time a radio signal was received, and thus, if the radio receivers failed, 15 minutes after the last signal came in, the timer would run out, and when it did so, the oil pumps would be set to minimum output. This would also trigger another pair of timers. After a further 2 minutes, a signal flare would be ignited, which would then be fired to alert the control ship that Agamemnon was no longer receiving signals. And then after another 3 minutes, without signal, the main steam valves would be shut, giving about 5 minutes between the cut-off of fuel and the cut-off of steam, thus minimizing any chances of overpressure. And with the oil pumps and the steam valves shut, the ship would coast to a complete halt. And just in case something happened that cut out the ship's main power circuits, which of course were running the whole thing, the entire control system, including the safety mechanisms, was supplied with their own backup battery array. So as long as one of the control rooms was operating, the ship couldn't go running off to the horizon. It was also noted that in testing, there were certain angles at which the control range was considerably greater than at others. This was due to interference from the upper works of the control ship, interfering with the transmission lines, meaning that generally the control ship needed to be directly behind Agamemnon, or else have her on the port or starboard beam, as at these angles you got the longest range out of the transmitters. And that was quite an important feature, as with live ammunition being flung at the ship, it was generally held that the control vessel should try to stay at least a mile or 2 behind the Agamemnon to avoid being hit itself. And that wraps up this brief summary of Agamemnon's role as a radio-controlled target ship. As I noted earlier, I'm going to try and find the relevant gunnery exercise records next time I'm down at the Q archives, and in the future I'm also going to try and look around and see what systems USS Iowa had aboard and how they differed from those in the Royal Navy.